Excuse me, I know this is, well, a bad time, but I just wanted to congratulate you and shake your hand.
Oh, on what?
Well, as I interpret what you're doing here, this is all a very complex discussion of reality versus illusion, the perfect subject for the television medium.
What do you mean, television?
Oh, this is a television play.
What?
You don't believe that?
Of course not.
I should have thought you'd want to. After all, there's only one other possible explanation.
Which is?
Hallucination. That you are altogether insane.
Tell me more about the television part.
Hi-ho, and welcome again to a feat of lunatic daring, the most sensational, inspirational, celebrational, muppetational podcast about Jim Henson and his Muppets. My name is Chad. I'm here with my co-host, Nick. How is the world, Nick Jackson?
That is an interesting and dangerous question.
I don't think we have any news to talk about or anything like that. We're not really doing news or anything on the show yet.
I mean, the clips for this episode were a lot of fun to watch, especially seeing some more of the non-Muppet aspects of what Jim did.
Yeah, we watched some weird stuff. Actually, we watched 3 things today, and only one of them had puppets.
Yeah.
So let's go ahead and let's get started. Hey, Chad here. I'm both new and bad at this. What should have happened during the previous segment is I should have said, please check out our social media at Lunatic Daring on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and go to lunaticdaring.com, where you will find our sources list as well as a bunch of video links to help you get started if you want to watch along with us. Cool, thanks. Won't happen again. Okay, it'll probably happen again.
In the mid-'60s, the Muppets spent a lot of time on the road. Rolf's role on The Jimmy Dean Show was so popular that when Jimmy took the show on tour, Henson and Oz went with him. They played Vegas, Carnegie Hall, and even the Louisiana State Fair. It paid well, and there was a lot of fun to be had, but Jim didn't have any time to enjoy it. Starting in the spring of 1964, he used every moment he could spare to work on his new short film, shot with a used Bolex camera that he had bought in the 50s to teach himself animation. This 9-minute film called Timepiece would be written by Jim, shot by Jim, produced by Jim, directed by Jim, with music by Jim, and, most notably, it would star Jim. There would be no puppets. There would be no script. While Timepiece was a personal and solo project, Henson would still recruit members of the Muppets gang to help him when he needed to. Frank Oz remembers that while they were in Vegas for a Jimmy Dean show, Jim dragged him out to the desert to grab a shot of Jim running down the road in convict stripes. In Manhattan, they snagged a few frames of him using a crosswalk dressed in a loincloth. Oz had to wear a gorilla costume while on a pogo stick, and somewhere along the way, they painted an elephant pink. Timepiece, originally called Time to Go, is a deceptively complicated piece. But what it's about is pretty cut and dry. Timepiece is about time and a man running, Jerry Jewell observed. Jim was always running from time.
If you would have asked Jim Henson, as many probably did, if this film had anything to do with the sudden death of his brother at 23, and the resulting revelation that he, too, like all of us, was on a ticking clock, he would have denied it. He would tell you that his pieces start with ideas, visuals or sounds, or a technical challenge. He would probably tell you that he just wanted to make something different, entertaining, funny, weird. Something to show his potential as a true avant-garde filmmaker. And all of that may be true. Maybe it means nothing. But there are only 4 spoken lines of dialogue in Timepiece. They are each just a single word, the same word, and they are all spoken by Henson. His face replacing Washington's on the dollar bill. His disembodied head on a serving tray. Being shot out of the sky like Jack Skellington. And one last time, peeking out from a toilet bowl right before being flushed away. Each time Jim looks at the camera, and with a meek and plaintive voice that is clearly his own, he pleads, "Help!" So, timepiece.
Yeah. There's a lot packed into under 10 minutes.
I had never seen this. I had never watched this until about a week ago.
I heard about it after I read A Tale of Sand for the first time, because it's like these are similar sort of, I guess for lack of a better term, you'd call them the more artsy things that Jim wanted to do. And this is before he started doing some of the secondary world fantasy stuff where he's just experimenting with the medium and the form. And they say there's no script, there's no story to it, but you can still track a very clear progression of, I guess, his mental state. Because there's like a recurring theme of diverted paths of he starts out as a guy at work fantasizing about a coworker, and then he's married to the coworker, and he's wondering about another life he might have lived. And there's this, I mean, the theme of it running out of time is already probably overstated, but the degree to which you see things sort of separate and split off as he fears lost time is something that's really, really effective given how short and how experimental the piece is.
And funny.
It's super funny.
It's still really funny. Just to get some kind of stats out of the way, Timepiece came out in 1965. It's about 9 minutes long. It premiered at the Museum of Modern Art on May 6th, 1965. They tried to get distributors to put it in theaters, but what are you going to do with a 9-minute film? It did end up running, what does it say here? It ran for 18 months at the Paris Theater in New York City. I believe coupled with a film called A Man and a Woman, a French film, which I have seen part of, that actually won the Oscar for Best Foreign Language Film that year. But yeah, it's got no puppets, Nick.
But it's still very Jim, and I think that there's something about this that does sort of beg the question, how much of what we loved about the Muppets was Jim and how much of it was the Muppets, but to see the other directions that he grew in a little bit. Because at this point in time, he's just in love with film. Like, he's in love with filming things and finding ways to integrate that film or animate certain aspects of it. And you see a lot of those visual effects when it's mapped to the drum beat of whatever's going on that are very reminiscent of what we would eventually see on Sesame Street.
I was gonna say this. What this reminded me of more than anything is what we're going to talk about next week with Sesame Street. Mm-hmm. The animation is straight out of Sesame Street.
Oh yeah,
that's what hit me first. Watching it was his the use of sound design, obviously the way he's editing on it, but then those little animation breaks are exactly what he would do on Sesame Street when he was doing the animation. Did you know this was nominated for an Oscar, by the way?
I'd read about it.
This was nominated for, it won a couple of awards, but it was nominated for Best Short Subject Live Action at the 1966 Oscars, and it lost to a French short called La Poule. And according to Frank Oz, do you know which film Jim Henson voted for?
La Poule.
La Poule. Yeah, apparently Jim voted against his own movie for the Oscar, but apparently he had a very good time at the ceremony. But you're going to do a better job than I am. It's hard to explain this film. I think, to me, I don't know why I've been racking my brain trying to figure out a way to explain it.
So Jim is someone, again, who likes the idea of immersing you in a lot of the visuals, a lot of the sound effects, the driving force of sound. It is sort of like a proto-music video, right?
Yeah.
Probably something more akin to what Michael Jackson would have done in the 80s, where you did have those weird, like, short films. It has a very strong motif of the passage of time, but there's also this sort of recursive aspect, because he'll go back in costume to earlier times where they might have been in more aristocratic clothes, or they might be dressed up as cavemen, or in certain cases he's just running around in torn clothes, looking as though he just got out of some sort of a wreck, or he was on a deserted island or something. I tend to get irritated when I hear people try to talk about the symbology or implications of the way that certain things are done, but it's a very abstract film, so it's kind of hard to describe it without doing that.
There is a narrative. I think it would be unfair to say there isn't a narrative.
Mm-hmm.
There definitely is, but yes, you're right. It's abstract. It's if it's not meant to be taken in different ways, if it's not meant to be interpreted, then I don't know what it's meant for then.
different people are going to take different things out of it, right?
Yeah.
So if you're seeing someone go through the course of a day or maybe a couple of years or a lifetime, everything doesn't necessarily have to mean something, but there's this consistency in the energy for it. You know how if someone is, if your pulse is racing, that usually means that if someone's close to fainting or something, their pulse is usually going to be racing. It won't be slow, right?
Right.
There's this frantic energy in this piece that seems to be born of the fear of lost time or of time running out. And there are so many different things that might apply or appeal, whether it's him learning how to fly toward the end of the piece, or them seeing the belly dancer, or him being very attracted to the secretary, or...
This is the horniest thing we've seen so far, right?
That's a fair statement.
This is probably the horniest Jim we've seen at this point, at least. I mean, I know we're early on, but...
Cube had its moments, but it wasn't quite as overt as this is.
What I picked up in the film was there are actually some kind of contemporary references in it. The scene where they're eating, the dinner scene, is a straight up satire of Tony Richardson's 1963 adaptation of Tom Jones. I
didn't catch that at all.
Yeah, there's a scene in Tom Jones that's very similar to it, and in this, in this scene they actually like regress to their cavemen selves almost, right? They're eating turkey legs, and eating's very primal.
She's got like a stick of celery, and he's eating, I think, was it a steak?
Yeah, and he's got a turkey leg at some point, like he's at the Ren Fair.
And then there's that whole scene exchange with them just stamping the different forms.
Yeah, I wrote that down. File, rush, conform, paid, sex, and damn. That's where the words they got stamped. Okay, I did notice his. I mean, yes, we're talking about the passage of time, but it's also about the monotony of everyday life, because his job. What is it? His job seems to be pushing a lever that makes rusty cans on a conveyor belt move one way, and then making them move the other way.
Yeah, I was wondering if there's something I was missing about that, but
I just think it's meant to be useless. Yep, this is what I come in and do. I do this thing, and I do this thing, and I go home, and it doesn't mean anything to me. It's just a couple of rusty paint cans on a conveyor belt. So I thought that was kind of cool. I got nothing on the pink elephant, though.
Yeah, that's... I mean, this is pre-Dumbo, I'm assuming, so...
No, this is post-Dumbo. Dumbo came out in 1941.
Oh, wow, my Disney history is shot. But, so, okay, there's probably a pretty direct reference there, but even then, the pink elephants in that were indicative of an altered mind state, weren't they?
Yes, the pink elephant's on parade. Yes, that's the drunken sequence. The one thing I did like about the elephant, oddly enough, this movie's full of cool sounds, and the sound of them painting the elephant's tail I liked. There was like a little like flip sound when he did that. I thought that was kind of cool.
The sounds do most of the work. Like, Jim's visual style is still very present. The pacing feels very right, but so much of that is driven by the soundtrack of this 9-minute piece that it never really stops.
It's a collage, right?
Yeah.
It's a collage of images and sound. It's funny because I had read about it, and I actually thought it was going to be more abstract than it was, oddly. More, I studied film in college, and so I've seen a lot of like old Soviet montage filmmaking, where it's all about the editing and this image plus this image equals this image, and they weren't as, in Soviet montage editing was a little bit of a kickback against Hollywood continuity editing. In Hollywood, continuity editing is just the editing you're not supposed to notice. You're just supposed to, this guy walks to here, opens the door, does this. It doesn't do anything except present the reality, and you're not supposed to notice it. Soviet montage, you're supposed to notice it. You're supposed to notice the cuts. The cuts mean things. The juxtapositions mean things. So this, to me, was somewhere in between those two things, because I could definitely follow... Again, I could definitely follow what he was saying, or what he was... Not what he was saying, what he was...
There's a very clear progression, I think.
Yeah. I don't think it's as obscure as it may seem on the surface. Or as obtuse. as it may seem on the surface. I think that it's just, would he say it was about these things? I don't know.
Probably not.
He was pretty tight-lipped about that.
I think another big part of it, too, is when you hear about something that's more experimental or something that's more abstract, it usually comes with the expectation that the audience has to do more work. Like, you've got to be willing to either suspend disbelief in a certain way or make certain logical leaps.
Intellectually engage. You have to intellectually engage with it.
And you don't, you should absolutely engage with Timepiece, but you don't have to. You can enjoy it.
No, because it's kind of like a sketch from Sesame Street, right? It's just purely entertaining as well. I wanted to talk about the striptease, first of all, because, I'm a perv, but I mean, Jim Henson's showing us a striptease. Now she's got pasties on, so he does, curb himself a little bit, but he seems very interested in it. But the shot of the peeling banana, though, a little on the nose.
It was a little bit, but I think that that's something, forgive any potential pretension. So the concept of libido isn't exclusively sexual, right? There's this sort of lust for life aspect that I think Jung described. And I think that that's a driving force for this entire thing. And yeah, certain aspects of it are sexual. We just discussed the stamps and the sound effects for while the secretary walked down the hall. But I think that that's part of a larger hunger, I guess.
But what do the dancing chickens have to do with it, though?
I'm trying to find a tactful way to answer that.
Because what I noticed in the striptease is like they have the striptease scene, and he's acting like a red-blooded man watching a striptease, but then it cuts to some like a dead chicken dancing, but it also cuts to as a parent, I found this interesting. It cuts to a shot of a little girl or boy running naked in a yard.
Yeah, that was
which as a parent is a very familiar thing. Keeping clothes on your kids is a full-time activity. Right. My youngest would never wear clothes if she didn't have to. So seeing a naked kid running around is completely natural to me. But to intercut it within this kind of this moment of this striptease and with the chicken and everything, it felt I don't know. It brought up all sorts of weird things for me.
That is totally fair. I think it was clumsy, especially by today's standards. I don't think I don't think it was necessarily sexualizing the kid so much as...
Oh, no, I don't think it was sexualizing the kid. I think it was saying something about maybe the human form, maybe our sexualization of people.
Possibly.
And bodies are bodies.
But I think it was, especially in context of you having seen the chicken and all the other stuff, I think it was just looking for something unadulterated, while simultaneously thinking something pervy, and I realize that that's a contradiction, but there's, especially given that we go starting in an office environment where he feels particularly constrained to certain things that are more primal, there's a sort of simplicity that comes with just thinking about the other thing, right? You're not worried about processes, you're not worried about anything else. You know that this is something that you find appealing, and because that's what you're drawn to, you might pursue as the crow flies. Aspects of this are probably not going to age as well as he might have hoped. But I think with that, I think that he was aiming at simplicity, right? As we're losing time, as we have all these different processes that we've got to observe and that we're beholden to, seeing a woman dancing on stage and thinking whatever Jim was thinking while he was watching that woman dance on stage was something that was relatively straightforward and simple.
I like what you said there about simplicity. It is a very kind of, in its own way, a streamlined vision of life. Mm-hmm. Without all the unnecessary talking and all that stuff. It's just the beats and the beats and the beats and the beats. It's very rhythmic. It's all about, it's so cut to a particular rhythm, and that rhythm keeps propelling you through, like time keeps propelling you through. But the main things, though, I don't want to spend 4 hours. We could probably talk about Timepiece for like a long time, but we got a lot to talk about on the show, and it is only 9 minutes long. But there are 4 lines of dialogue in the entire film, if you don't count the Tarzan yell, and they're all the word help.
Help.
I mean, not to beat the same drum, but I do think that still ties into the simplicity bit, because whether it's his head in the toilet or him trying to fly or anything like that.
I got written down here, shot down like Jack Skellington on Christmas Eve. That's what happens to him when he's flying. He takes off. He's flying. He magically springs wings, and then everything on the ground, including a fire extinguisher, and a couple other things, like shoot him out of the sky. It was very.
Also, I mean, it was pretty clearly an Icarus illusion, but
yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right.
But,
fine if you want to get fancy with it.
Well, no. Like, there's. Nothing against the Skellington, right?
You go Icarus, I go Tim Burton. It's fine.
Tim Burton's Icarus would probably be a really interesting movie.
He would spend way too much money on it, and it would have Johnny Depp in it, and it would be a disaster.
We're talking like 90s Tim Burton.
Okay, that'd be fine. Right after Ed Wood. Then, yeah, we go.
I would just want Danny DeVito to play Daedalus. That would be my one request.
Yeah. I was struck by the help. If you do see it as this kind of runaway time, you know, this image of time just getting away from you. I just wonder if that's him just literally, is that his despair? Is that his at time, or is that his desire to slow things down? Like things are moving so fast. Help?
Probably. But I think there's also something else to... So Jim is someone who was very, very expressive and very creative when he put on performances, but he wasn't someone who would necessarily express a lot of what he thought interpersonally, at least according to the biographies.
No, he was a quiet man. He was known as a pretty, a soft-spoken man. He was not someone who, Frank Oz said he never saw him like legitimately angry or yell at anybody. He was a fairly reserved guy, which from what we've read, it looks like he got from his father. That's a very kind of Midwestern kind of thing. So
if he's someone who has a hard time articulating what might be going on in his head, say he is still processing and grieving, and he was suddenly aware that some of the things he might have taken for granted up to a certain point, or the people that he would have taken for granted that they would be there up to a certain point, are no longer there. He's not necessarily going to have the words or tools to explain, this is why I'm feeling, this is where my head's at, these are a problem. The most he might be able to do would literally be to say, here's all of this stuff. Also, I need help.
Help.
Like, just help.
No, I mean, and yes, using that, not being able to say it, so using your talents to express it in other ways, obviously is what this is doing. I mean, listen, it's hard not to think about Paul Jr. when you're looking at this, because so many different people along the way have, including friends of his, have ascribed his obsession with time running out to Paul Jr.'s death. And that I can't imagine it. I mean, I don't want to imagine it. My brother's safe and sound, knock on wood. But it feels, I can't imagine that it wouldn't affect you in some way. And this idea of this, I mean, it starts off with a heartbeat, right? And what is a heartbeat? A heartbeat is our ticking clock.
It starts with him in a hospital, and his brother made it to the hospital before he passed.
He did. It's true. He didn't make it out. But when he does and it's a funny bit where he like turns the stethoscope around and it becomes a different heartbeat or something. I'm trying to remember. But a heartbeat is our, it is our ticking clock. Eventually it's going to stop ticking. Mm-hmm. But you mentioned the hospital. So at the end, it turns out he's the doctor.
Yeah.
And then he winks at us, which I found a little disconcerting. What I was fascinated by was, listen, we know he was a brilliant performer, but this was him for 9 minutes starring in this film.
Yeah.
And no, he's not doing any heavy lifting as an actor. He's mostly just walking from here to there, but he seems fairly effortless. He's funny. He handles the moments well. He doesn't look uncomfortable. To me, the biggest revelation coming out of Timepiece was just getting to see Jim Henson act.
The only other time I've seen him do any sort of acting on screen, he had a cameo in Into the Night randomly.
Yeah, this was just, I don't know. I mean, it's, again, for me, it's hard to describe because it is so about the sounds and the cuts and the rhythm and the music but I can see if this was a more popular thing, if this was something that like everybody had seen, I could tell you which filmmakers had ripped it off their entire lives. But I'm not sure Edgar Wright has ever seen this.
I wouldn't be surprised if he had.
I guess I don't know enough about Timepiece to know if it was influential, but it certainly feels like it could have been.
The funny thing about it is, like, I went to school for writing. Storytelling is very important to me. This is one of the first shorts I've seen that has actually made me want to make a quote-unquote film.
Yeah.
And it would be a short. I wouldn't necessarily want to do a full-length one. But seeing the way that the medium is sort of folded into... It feels weird to call it a narrative, but it is. Like, there's a plot progression of sorts.
There is. I mean, you go through the... I mean, he ends up running through a graveyard in a tuxedo, and... Oh. I mean, there's definitely a hospital and life and death, and I mean, there's all sorts of... there's definitely... It definitely progresses through a story. As someone who went to film school and has made short films, most of them are terrible. And I mean, your short film should never be more than 10 minutes long. I don't care what your professor tells you. Because, and I have a problem, to me, like a bad 15-minute short film seems like a longer sit than a good 3-hour movie. I've gone to many film festivals. When my film was out, I went to a lot of festivals. I would go to the short film programs. You'd meet the short film filmmakers, and they're very passionate about what they do. And every once in a while, you hit one, and you're like, yeah, that was really interesting or fascinating. But most of the time, it's just 15. It's like they don't take advantage of what you're talking about. They don't take advantage of the fact that they have this short amount of time to do something special. They just try to tell a story in the same way a movie would. They just tell a lot less story, and it becomes... Every short film in college is the same thing. It's a film, and they all have punchlines. They're all jokes. Whether it's a comedic punchline or not, it's always you get to the end, and it's like, oh, okay, all right. That's what this was, because that's the structure that's set up for short films. This doesn't really have that. This has a clear vision from start to finish. If I had made this in film school, I would be a god now. For someone who has never done this before, he had played with animation, of course, at home, and he had made plenty of stuff. But for someone to sit back, and especially the way he made this, I mean, we barely talked about that, where he's putting it together. He had all these storyboards, but he's out there, dragging poor Frank and Jerry around the United States, following Rolf and Jimmy Dean, just going like, hey, come on. I can just imagine, I just have images in my head of him like knocking on their hotel room door at like 3 a.m. Being like, we got to get out there to get that sunset shot. And they're like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, the dog doesn't go on till 8 o'clock tonight. So to piece it together, to have the vision, to see it. I mean, I'm sure a lot of it was made in the editing room, but to have this vision of it and put it together the way he did, and it just to be so, I didn't expect it to be so confident and coherent.
Yeah. Thinking
about it as being this early short film, I was ready for it to be anything and to like it. I was ready for it to be anything and to forgive it for its... its inadequacies or its amateurism. Like you go, okay, it sounds cool.
It's really solid, though.
It's a great piece of work. It's a legitimate great piece of work, and I was pleasantly surprised by that, because I was expecting. Again, I don't tend to like short films, so even ones made by people that I admire, and it was that. But again, it was only 9 minutes long. We've now talked about it for about 3 times the length of it. So I think we'll move on. But it is available online. I believe it is available like on YouTube. Check it out, people.
It's definitely worth a watch.
It's only 9 minutes. Some of the ramblings that we've been having will make a little more sense once you've actually seen it, once it's hit your eye holes.
It may or may not be appropriate for children.
It may or may not. It's not. It's
It's not the worst.
If your kids are old enough to like get any of the sexual references, then they're old enough to see it, because it's still pretty tame.
Yeah,
and
especially by today's standards.
It's probably my favorite thing we've watched so far.
It's definitely up there for me.
Well, during this time on the road with Dean, Jane had given birth to the Hensons' first son, Brian, and Jim had also added a new member to his work family, 31-year-old Jerry Nelson, a native Oklahoman who had tried his hand at both soldiering and acting before he fell into puppetry, working for the great Bill Baird, a master puppeteer, who we probably should have at least mentioned on the podcast by now. It was through Baird that Nelson met Bobby Payne, Henson's old friend and sometimes employee, who suggested that Nelson would be a good match for Jim. Jerry was sweet and funny, with a wonderful singing voice. Most importantly for Jim, Jerry could do voices. At that point, pretty much every Muppet had been voiced by Henson. Jewel had done a few, but he was moving away from performing, and Frank Oz had sworn he would never use his voice for any of the characters. Jerry was just what he needed. Jim hired him, but only part-time. His first work would be on a series of ads for Southern Bread that featured a live hand puppet Southern Colonel, which, yes, seems a little in poor taste looking back on it.
All this time, Muppets Inc. was doing quite well making commercials. For LaChoy, they made their first full-sized walk-around Muppet, Delbert, a tall dragon that breathed fire to convince you to buy LaChoy noodles. Despite Don Celine's innovation in building Delbert, it wasn't exactly an easy puppet to operate. Jim sized up the suit, imagined how miserable it was going to be inside of there, and immediately gave the job to Frank Oz.
Sunday night supper, and I don't feel like cooking.
Wait! May I make a suggestion?
Good heavens, there's a dragon in my kitchen.
I'm the LaChoy Dragon, and may I recommend LaChoy Chow Mein.
How did a dragon get in my kitchen?
LaChoy Chow Mein is crisp, never mushy, as good as the takeout kind. That's because it's quick cooked by me in dragon fire.
They were also hired to make 4 short coffee break films for IBM. Little funny pieces they could show to their employees in between the boring presentations at corporate meetings. It was during that process that Jim met IBM executive David Laser, who admired Jim, appreciated the way he worked, and came to really enjoy just being around the man. Remember that name, David Laser. It will come back. Shouldn't be too hard. The dude's name is Laser. That year, the Jimmy Dean Show ended its 3-year run. Frank Oz had taken some vacation time, so on the final episode, Jerry Nelson acted Rolf's right paw. The country star would have a long and profitable career selling processed meats. And on the Ed Sullivan Show in 1967, he and Rolf got to exchange a few final one-liners.
Jimmy, it's good to see you again.
And it's good to see you.
Hey, you know, I got some great country jokes that I wrote here for the Ed Sullivan Show.
What?
Yes, and it's all about, how I was raised with a bunch of cows.
Not a bunch, herd.
Herd of what?
Herd of cows.
Sure, I heard of cows.
No, I mean cows herd.
I don't care if the cows hurt. I haven't said anything to be ashamed of.
Right, herd, H-E-A-R-D.
Jimmy, you gotta milk these jokes. Milk them.
Milk them? They're the worst jokes I ever heard.
Is that H-E-R-D or H-E-A-R-D?
Never mind that. Just forget that.
Okay, I get it. I guess I just made a big fool of myself out here in front of this whole big bunch of people.
No.
Talk shows became a regular occurrence for the Muppets. During the Sam and Friends days, they had done Steve Allen and Jack Parr. But in 1966, they became regular guests on Ed Sullivan and did a few appearances on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, although, as Jerry Jewell later noted, Carson was not one of those people comfortable talking to the puppets. It was also the first year Jim allowed any of his creations to be merchandised. He was approached by the Ideal Toy Company to create Rolf and Kermit puppets. Jim reluctantly accepted, remembering some unpleasant business over the ownership of Wilkins and Wontkins. He even produced a commercial for the toys that, because he could never help himself, ended with 2 Kermits threatening the viewer, "Buy us, or we'll bite you in the leg."
Back in 1965, John Stone and Tom Whedon were veteran television writers who had been struggling to find work. 2 years before, they had drunkenly quit the Captain Kangaroo show after a blowout with the show's producer and star, the captain himself, Bob Keeshan. Since then, they had tried to move out of children's programming, to make the move as writing partners of more mature material, but no one was biting. But when they came to the shockingly young 25-year-old CBS executive Fred Silverman with an idea for a kids' show based on Snow White, he was interested. One of Stone and Whedon's ideas was that unlike that other Snow White, this one would feature 7 woodland creatures, not dwarves, and they would be played by puppets. Puppets, Silverman thought? He knew the guy. "We are going to meet with Christ and his dog," Silverman told them. The Jimmy Dean Show was still in full swing, and Rolf the dog was one of the most famous people on TV. His operator, less so, but that was okay by Jim. The Muppets were still remarkably busy with commercials and were making talk show appearances nearly every week. Despite this schedule, Henson agreed to meet with Stone and Whedon as a favor to Silverman. He listened to the 2 men pitch their show, then, after making a few suggestions on the design of the puppets, agreed to do it. Whedon, son of John and father of Joss, Jed, and Zach, all of them successful TV writers, brought in a friend of his from Harvard, a young pianist and songwriter, Joe Raposo, to write some original songs for the production. The show really seemed to be coming together.
And just as quickly, it fell apart. Snow White died before it put a single frame to film, like most ideas in Hollywood. The three men took the show to another network, who wanted it, but with one caveat: lose Snow White. So they swapped one, not technically copywritten princess for another. What about Cinderella? This time, they even took a shot at a pilot, with everyone aboard: Jim, Frank, Jerry Nelson, and Joe Raposo. The network seemed to love it, until they didn't. The pilot never aired. It had gotten farther than Snow White, but this wasn't horseshoes or hand grenades. 3 years later, with even more success under his belt, Henson came back to Stone and Whedon and asked them if they thought the old Cinderella pilot could be expanded to fill an hour. He wanted to adapt it into a television special, the first in a fairy tale anthology series that he was going to call Tales from Muppet Land. The special, Hey Cinderella, would sit on the shelf for 2 years before anyone ever saw it.
Well, Stone, take an invitation. You are invited to a masked ball at the palace. Bring a present for the king. No, change that. Why not bring a present for the king? No, change that. Why not bring a present for the king if you know what's good for you? Even though I wouldn't do anything to you if you didn't bring one, probably. Okay? And sign it, loads of love, Your Royal Highness, and address it to occupants.
Yes, Your Majesty.
I would say in a completely different vein, next we're talking about the Tales from Muppet Land, Hey Cinderella, which does have puppets and is a much more, I guess we would say, traditional, what you would think of as a Muppet production.
Absolutely. And I think a big part of that, especially given Jim's love of fairy tales and folk tales and things like that, that subversion that you would see in a Muppet thing added more depth than you would have expected from, I guess, a lot of the shows that you would have seen about fairy tales this time. And I'm thinking in particular of Disney movies. Everyone on screen was a character.
Yes. Yeah, we got Rufus back. Rufus is
back.
Land of the Tinkerdee. He doesn't get to talk anymore.
King Oshkosh does not look like King Oshkosh. Or excuse me, Gosh
Posh.
I'm going to make that mistake at least 3 more times.
And then Featherstone's kind of an evolution of the Prime Minister from Tales of Tinkerdee.
Mm-hmm.
But this is also, I think, well, I guess Land of Tinkerdee did this, but
the people in the Muppets on at the same time,
coexisting to the point where King Gosh Posh's son is played by a human.
Mm-hmm.
And Cinderella is a human, but her stepsisters are puppets, yet her stepmother is a human, and the fairy godmother's a human. So it is this mix of, yeah, there's no line anymore. They just exist in this world together. And this is going to be something that carries on later. And one of the criticisms I do have of Hey Cinderella is I do believe the stuff with just the humans falls a little flat,
mm-hmm.
which happens. I think, and it'll be a long time until we get to this, but I think one of the things that made the Muppet Christmas Carol work is a very strong performance by Michael Caine. And you actually don't mind the time you spend with Michael Caine, even if there are no Muppets with him. In this, like, especially when Cinderella sings her song, which apparently was left over from the original. That's a Joe Raposo original. What's the song called? If I Could Go Dancing, I think, which I definitely could have gone without. One thing to mention, just bookkeeping wise, if you watch this, and again, this was filmed in 1968. It didn't come out. It came out in Canada, actually, in 1969, and then didn't air in the U.S. until 1970, after a certain children's television workshop program made the Muppets famous. It's technically the first time Kermit is called a frog. He actually plays a frog in it. He's kind of a self-hating frog at times. He's a little down on being a frog.
I feel like he's mostly just resigned to being a frog. I don't know that he necessarily hates being a frog so much as he hates how frogs are treated.
I personally know you, and I'm not stuck up.
Yeah, but you're not a girl.
I know I'm a frog. You don't have to keep reminding me.
That's a good point. Kermit is kind of a jerk in this, though. He is kind of. He's not the Kermit that we know.
He's absolutely the Kermit we know.
He's pretty grumpy.
I would say that this is like Kermit working his way up the ladder in order to manage the Muppet Show. Kermit, like early in his career before he's got any sort of clout. And
to note, because of the timing, Sesame Street had already aired when this came out. He was already known as Kermit the Frog from Sesame Street. So while this is technically the first time they made him a frog, it wasn't the moment where everybody found out he was a frog.
I imagine that if the show had gone on, or if they'd had more than just Cinderella, and if it had been an anthology format, which I think it was aiming at doing.
I wasn't able to find anything about what the show would have been. Mm-hmm. You know, kind of the same way with Tinkerdee, you know, where we watched the pilot of Tinkerdee, both pilots of Tinkerdee, and we're like, I don't know what the show would have been. This was kind of the same for me. Like, Cinderella is a pretty self-contained story.
I wasn't imagining it as like the first as a part of an anthology, and the idea that we would go, say, from Cinderella to Red Riding Hood to, I don't think they would have done Bluebeard, but a number of other fairy tales and fables with Kermit the Frog as the frog that was also in Cinderella and other things, being the one recurring character as he just travels around and ends up in these particular things, would have been an intriguing development. He sort of did that on The Storyteller, and we'll get to that at a later date. But if you think of a comparative thing to what Shelley Duvall did, the integration of the storyteller into the story either is completely unaware or it's not self-aware, and the storyteller isn't actually the storyteller, but just a viewpoint character that's going through these things. Or conversely, they exist outside of the story and sometimes lean on or break the fourth wall.
Yeah, Kermit in these early days, I'm not sure how much confidence Jim had in Kermit during these times, because he was, in Tinkerdee, he was the narrator, right? He was the minstrel, but he was basically our chorus, our narrator. In this, he's got this kind of supporting role. He does break the fourth wall in this, I think, a couple of times, just kind of making jokes. One note that I did have just as a writer and someone who's written television episodes is I thought the act break jokes were a little anemic. When they were going out to acts, they were just kind of I also wanted to point out, so the woman who plays Cinderella, Belinda Montgomery, this was like her second role. She was only 18. She went on to have a long career as like a TV day player. But I wanted to tell you about this one. Robin Ward, who played the prince, was 25 when they shot this, so a little older. But before this, he was like a weatherman, so he spent a lot of his career as a day player, actor, as a guest actor, playing like reporters and announcers and stuff. Mm-hmm. He narrated the 1985 to 1989 Twilight Zone. He was the narrator. Yeah.
Interesting.
Which, because he's got, apparently he's got kind of a cool voice. And then, and the other big thing was that Joyce Gordon, who played the godmother, she's most famous now. She was the lunch lady in Billy Madison.
Have some more sloppy joes.
This also is our first appearance of Splurge,
mm-hmm.
Which is, I think, their first larger-than-life full-bodied puppet, which would, of course, lead to Big Bird pretty soon. They had done ones that were full-sized, but this is the first one. It's a good, half person taller than a real person?
I think so, yeah.
Which is kind of what Big Bird is. So I'm guessing it's kind of got the same architecture inside, where the puppeteer has their hand over their head, controlling the head. Splurge would show up on Ed Sullivan, but blue instead of purple. He would show up a few times in other things. He was never a huge character. And the Stepsisters, if you listen to them, were very obviously performed by Frank Oz and Jerry Nelson. If you listen to their voices, they sound like Miss Piggy and Emmett Otter on Helium. It's very clear. Yeah, I didn't enjoy this as much as you did. I liked it. Like I said, the stuff with the humans just killed me. It just dragged it down for me.
It was my least favorite of the main three things that we watched this week, which isn't to say that I didn't enjoy it. But I just have a soft spot for some of the tropes that were present. They did subvert a lot of fairy tale, I don't want to call them, they're fairy tale tropes. And there was more presence and more development there. But in terms of the quality of the acting and things like that, maybe I just gave it more of a pass. I don't know.
Well, it's basically, I wrote down it's Cinderella meets Much Ado About Nothing with a little bit of Aladdin. It has the kind of typical Cinderella setup. I love the fact that King Goshposh is always just like the nicest king in the world. He's the exact opposite of I mean, in this, he's probably more dictatorial than he is in other things, but he's still pretty nice for a monarch. But in this, it had the Cinderella story, but then it also had the mistaken identity story, right? With the prince where they meet and she thinks he's a gardener.
That was a clever touch, I think, especially with them meeting again because so much of the way that Cinderella, I think there's that famous Vonnegut lecture where he was describing the story structure of Cinderella and how it was atypical for a lot of story structures. But so much of Cinderella is the build-up to her meeting the prince on the night of the ball, losing the shoe, and him wondering what happened. But they subverted that a couple of times over. The way that they played with time in this was actually really entertaining because it's not resolved over the course of... This takes months to resolve.
Kermit even says that.
I could have solved this whole thing months ago, but who listens to a frog?
So you've got the initial subversion of Cinderella and the prince meeting, while the prince now has a hidden identity, which I don't think has been the case with the prince in most Cinderella adaptations. He's always very proud of the fact that he's the prince, whereas in this case, he's worried that if she knows that he's the prince, then she's only going to be attracted to him for his fame as opposed to...
And again, that's a very fairy tale trope as well, right? The prince pretending to be a pauper.
It is... But it's something atypical to Cinderella, like the specific Cinderella archetype.
Yeah, no, it's not a Cinderella thing. It's not. It's part of it's kind of a mashup.
So there's a weird sort of double inversion there. And then Jim actually just says, we're going to do away with a glass slipper. Okay, how are we going to resolve this without a glass slipper? Since you broke the glass slipper, why wouldn't you break a glass slipper if it's made out of glass?
Right.
She's got another glass slipper. We've already seeded the fact that her dog just keeps hiding things and forgetting where he hid things. So we're going to hide that other glass slipper because they want each other, but they don't know that they want each other. They're convinced by the mistaken identity thing. And so he twists it a few times. And it didn't run that long, I don't think. Maybe I'm misremembering the timestamp, but
No, it's not. It's not. I mean, it's very... I agree with you. I want to know, this whole concept came, well, not the whole concept, but yeah, it came from Tom Whedon and John Stone. I'll talk about it a little bit next week, but if you ever want to read about the night that they quit working for Captain Kangaroo, it's a doozy. Read the book Sunny Days. It talks about that night. So it is their story. Yeah, I just don't know what... I think you're right. I think an anthology show would have been interesting. That also sounds expensive.
Yeah.
For a program of that scale, that time, especially making... And now... Eventually, as we go forward, we're gonna develop things like the Muppet Workshop that are gonna be making new Muppets, new puppets, new characters for both Sesame Street and the Muppet Show daily. But they don't have that capacity yet. They're still using these old characters like Gosh Posh, like the sisters they're fine, but there's nothing especially memorable about how they're built.
No, the design definitely picks up.
What did I wrote here? Oh, Splurge Ex Machina is what I wrote on here because I think he kind of comes in the end and saves the day.
Out of context, never mind.
Yeah. I just remember, and I also wrote down a line that I really liked: a beautiful splurge drawn coach that Kermit describes, which I thought was kind of cute. Yeah, it's got music by Joe Raposo. We'll hear a lot about next episode. Some of it I didn't care for, like the song. But there was some music in it that, I don't know how to explain it. It was kind of background music, but it's got vocals in it, but they're sung real lightly. And there is some stuff like that in early seasons of Sesame Street. I could hear, at times, I heard the Joe Raposo that was going to become the composer for Sesame Street. I did hear that every once in a while, but I didn't think it was as consistent. And her song, in the grand tradition of Muppets, sometimes that just... It's basically like an I Want song, right? It's a musical I Want song. And I just think it's a little... I've used the word already, but I think it's a little anemic. It didn't come away singing the song. I think the humans acquit themselves well. I just don't think, and maybe it's just a contrast. The Muppets are so much fun.
It could also be early installment weirdness because, especially if the actors themselves aren't used to acting with Muppets or without.
And it's just a pilot as well. And again, this is her second role. She's 18 years old. He is very early. And everyone in this, most people in this, are very early in their career.
And I don't think they did bad necessarily.
I just felt that Again, maybe I was just wanting more Kermit, or I was just wanting more Muppets to be in the scene. It's interesting. This is the first of the Tales from Muppet Land series. There are 2 more entries, I think, that are technically Tales from Muppet Land that we will be talking about in coming weeks. One important thing to remember from Hey Cinderella, and I personally think the most important thing about Hey Cinderella, is the name John Stone. Is the co-writer of this John Stone. We're going to talk about him a lot next episode. This moment here, this is the moment where they met. And what we're kind of watching happen is that we're, as I've talked about before, we're watching the pieces of his team fall into play, but we're also watching, there's a little bit of alchemy happening here with the animation and timepiece and with some of the personnel on this. Again, we've already said it, so it's no spoilers. Next week is Sesame Street. And I can actually, when I'm watching this stuff, I can see Sesame Street coming.
I can see that. With the animations segments and timepiece and...
John Stone's involvement in this, and some of the humor is very Sesame Street in this.
Yeah, specifically the human to Muppet interactions, too. One of the things I liked that they did, and I didn't think about it actively, but I kind of prefer it, the Prince had already known Kermit. So the Muppets weren't treated as something new. They're just part of the world. And you touched on this earlier, but I'm going to have a relationship with these people. And sure, they're different, and sure, there might be some slight racism against frogs, but the Prince didn't have a problem.
Yeah, it is a little racist towards frogs. It is. The king does not like that frog.
And there's never a reason given for it either. He's just like, you've been hanging out with that frog again.
Yeah, I did like he invites everyone in the kingdom to the ball.
Better take a P.S. to that invitation.
Yes, sire.
P.S. No frog.
And then he starts to reconsider that. I think that maybe he should have been more specific.
When Splurge brings all of his high school buddies with him.
Yeah.
It's an early, I don't know, it's kind of, to me, it's kind of an early classic Muppets piece, though. Mm-hmm. I believe it was, I remember having a VHS copy of it at one point. So it was something that was available much more commercially throughout the years. I don't think it's in print right now.
This was my first time seeing it.
Yeah, but I remember like the VHS clamshell case of it. The next thing we're going to talk about is a lot harder to find and does not come in a colorful VHS clamshell. If Hey Cinderella seems a little safe and lukewarm to you, and you're not wrong, it totally is, don't worry, Jim hadn't forgotten about his more avant-garde aspirations. I said in our first episode that running off to Europe to learn how to paint may have been the most pretentious thing that Jim Henson had ever done. I retract that statement. I had forgotten all about Club Cyclia. Nick, what in the hell is a Club Cyclia?
Okay, so for us to really explain Club Cyclia, we have to make sure that a couple of things are very clear in context. First, this is 1967. This is pre-disco, right? Nightclubs didn't exist in the same way. Jim went to a Jefferson Airplane show, and he was really, really impressed by a lot of the lights and effects that they created. And he wanted to create, I guess, what he thought of as a full entertainment experience. So he envisioned a space where you would have a number of different reflective surfaces on the floor, on the walls, on the ceiling. At some point over the course of each hour, a woman would come out in reflective clothing, and they would reflect all sorts of different scenes off of her and all the things around them as music played. The floor and ceiling itself would be broken into these sort of faceted crystal-like shapes, which would become more common in nightclubs later on, especially during the 70s into the early 80s. But they wanted... The objective of Club Cyclia was a sort of full immersion, which... it tracks, right? Jim was also very, very big on using the frames of the television as the barriers for whatever storytelling he was trying to do. This seemed like it would be the next logical step, if you can call it that. Again, this is pre-disco, so they had a lot of difficulty finding a location that would be able to support the effort. And they started filming a bunch of clips for it. The filming started in 65, 2 years before they really started to get into it. They got footage from a Beatles concert in 65 in Shea Stadium. Frank Oz, in particular, went through thousands of feet of 16mm footage for Club Cyclia. It's another Henson project that didn't quite get off the ground, though that's only because it was ahead of its time.
In 1968, NBC started airing a series called NBC's Experiment in Television, a program that would promote experimental and avant-garde filmmaking, which, by the way, sounds awesome because there's no way a network would do that today. After years of studios rejecting Henson's more out-there ideas, this was a chance for him to stretch his legs and once again be that experimental filmmaker he saw himself as. He would end up making 2 programs for experiment in television. The first was called Youth 68, Everything's Changing, or Maybe It Isn't. Yes, that's the whole title, and it would make Fiona Apple proud. It was a documentary of sorts, but far more of an impressionistic collage than your average 60-minute segment. It was directed by John Stone, who was not as shy with his political opinions as Jim was. Time magazine described it as a visual and sound montage juxtaposing outspoken opinions on love, religion, drugs, and war with the sights and sounds of popular dance. Which is pretty accurate. It interviews young people, young adults mostly, not children, about what it's like to be a youth in 1968 in the wake of the famous 67 Summer of Love. It talks to average college students, hippies, psychologists, and members of Jefferson Airplane and the Mamas and the Papas.
I think this age is challenging us as a youth. We have our duties to do, and I think we can do them.
The kids today just want something for themselves, something they can grab onto and hold on to and say it's theirs.
And the kids want to be free, man, like, that's where it's at.
Well, youth is always an exciting time.
Well, it's certainly more exciting than it ever was before.
Yeah, sure, it's always more exciting. Than what?
A 2.5-minute clip of Youth 68 is on the Jim Henson Company's YouTube page. The whole thing is available for viewing at the Museum of Television and Radio. We plan on getting there soon, COVID willing, so we can come back with a full report. The pieces with the young people aren't exactly interviews, they're sound bites, presumably taken from longer conversations, chained together with music by Bob Dylan and The Who, and some groovy special effects. But apparently it does have a strong anti-war message, and kind of a bummer ending. But until we can see it in its entirety, it's hard to have opinions that we don't steal from someone else. Although Marty Balin of Jefferson Airplane makes a few good points while waving around what one must assume is a loaded pistol.
I think this generation realizes that they're the generation who's going to really have to, do an Oedipus on their fathers and just take over and really make it work, because everybody else before us have been saying this and saying that, and nobody's ever done it.
Youth 68 aired in April and was generally well received, appreciated for both its innovation and its content. It wasn't without controversy, as some Americans objected to many of the subject's messages, but that's what happens when you stick it to the man. NBC was pleased with Youth 68, and had no reservations producing and airing Jim's next entry in Experiment in Television, a piece that he and Jerry Jewell had been unsuccessfully shopping around for years. It's time to talk about the Cube.
This is weird. Hello? Can anyone hear me? What is this, a joke? All right, come on, let me out of here. This is weird.
Where do I begin with the cube?
Yeah, exactly. That's what the guy in the cube thinks.
Well, it's a closed loop, or an infinite loop, which is fascinating because it keeps coming back to...
But let's set it up first.
Sorry.
Quickly set it up. Cube was the movie that he did the next year for it. It was written by him and Jerry Jewell, yet again. It was originally written in 1966, but they, brushed it off for this. It's directed and produced by Jim, and it's about a guy in a white cube. It has been compared to, now this is the one bit of controversy about the cube, is that it is believed to have been inspired by / ripped off from a short story called The Squirrel Cage by Thomas Disch, and it's in his short story collection called Fun with Your New Head, which I like. I couldn't find the story to read online, so me being me, I ordered a paperback of it, but it hasn't come yet.
Yeah, I've never read that one.
People just think that maybe, hey, it's Chad here. I got my copy of Thomas M. Disch's Fun with Your New Head, compilation of short stories, and I read The Squirrel Cage. Other than it taking place inside of a white cube, in starring a man that doesn't know why he's in that cube. There's no other similarities. But you should definitely check out the story. It's very good. I really liked it. I'm probably going to go back and read the rest of it. But it's more introspective. There's no other characters in it, unlike the cube. To me, it's about the peril of being left alone with your own thoughts, and only your own thoughts all the time, without the distractions that keep our mind off of the heavy stuff, which for someone like me, at least, is terrifying. But it's not the same thing. So a guy, we don't see him waking up, but a guy is in a white cube. He doesn't know why he's there, and he doesn't know how to get out, but he also doesn't seem too distraught at first over it. Like, he seems to take it in stride that he's stuck in this white cube, at least for a while.
There's a level of disorientation, and I think one of the things that I would want to draw attention to first is this is about a 52-minute movie.
It probably took about an hour and a half on television with commercials.
This concept seems like something that you would maybe get through in a 15-minute short. Like, this is the kind of thing that you would see parodied in commercials or other short-form things, but it keeps going. And the funny thing about it is, the entire point of it is to sort of unmoor this guy's sense of reality. And he's given a name, but it's never his name. And he does and doesn't assert a very strong sense of self. Toward the end, he does start calling everyone on their stuff and being like, I know you guys are messing with me, but I don't know what's going on. But there's never a name. There's never any indication of what his life was like before he was in the cube. He only knows that he's stuck in there and he wants to get out.
And yet he doesn't want to get out at the same time. There's a little bit of the parable of the cave in here too. You know, he keeps getting visited by this procession of people. Mm-hmm. Specifically, I mean, a lot of visits from Arnie, who's the telephone. He's like the handyman, I guess.
It's the Robert De Niro in Brazil figure.
yeah. He's coming. He's there to fix the ducks. And it stars a guy named Richard Shaw. Had a pretty decent career. He was in George Roy Hill's version of Slaughterhouse-Five, his movie version of Slaughterhouse-Five in '72. And he did like episodes of like the Dukes of Hazzard and the Rockford Files. And he did 5 episodes of the Mary Tyler Moore Show, which is pretty great because that's an amazing show. Most of the other actors, you know, some of them have day playing careers and stuff. Did you notice that the monk, however, is played by Jerry Nelson?
I did not.
Yeah, that is Jerry Nelson playing the monk.
That's great.
Very young Jerry Nelson playing the monk. The one thing I did write down is a paranoid piece for a paranoid time. I don't know why. That's just what came to me.
Like, the cube is downright epistemological. There's a section where I think he breaks one of the tiles. So the cube itself, we should probably describe what it looks like, I realize.
Yeah.
It's basically a padded room. Like, you've got a bunch of different squares. Sometimes they open to reveal cabinets, or people will just open a segment of them and walk in or walk out. And one of the things that's repeated very early on is, this is the way out. This is doors for me. It's not for you.
This is not your door. Yeah.
And in order to get out of here, you need to find your door. Everything basically out of the gate is there to undermine his sense of what he would be able to take for granted, or what is actually real, or how he knows what's real. There's a segment where another guy breaks into the room, seeming like he's escaped from...
The prisoner, yeah.
Seeming like he's escaped from his own room, but his cell had squares, whereas the current guy's has rectangles, and that's making him very uncomfortable. And he's been stuck in there for a long time, but he's finally made his way out, but maybe he should go back in. And then he leaves, and one of the guys that seems to have a supervisor role comes in and asks if he met anyone else. And the lead guy says, no, I haven't met anyone, because obviously if something weird is going on, he's not going to talk to him about it. He's like, I'm sure someone did. And he brings the guy that had just broke into the room and explains that he's actually a very good actor.
Jack Van Evera. He calls him Jack Van Evera, which is the actor's real name.
It's great. There's another section.
The actor is playing himself.
I didn't catch that, but that's a great touch. Yeah. There's another section where a woman is in the room and she's expressing attraction to the guy, which he doesn't believe at first, and then he starts to believe it, and then a bunch of other people come in, and she's talking to one of her friends and saying, I lost that coin flip. I really wish I hadn't had to get together with this guy. Next time I'm going to be the one that comes in. And she spent so much time before that trying to get him to trust her, because that was the role that she was supposed to play.
Have you ever seen The Game, the David Fincher movie, The Game?
I have not.
It was David Fincher's follow-up to Seven. And there were some things in here that reminded me. Also, there's a little Truman Show to it. The idea, but you're right, the idea that they seem aware, or at least at times they're aware they're on a television program.
Well, that's just it, though, is it doesn't seem like they are. There's that segment where the tile is broken and you just see this weird sort of
red undulating.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like this red undulating mass outside.
Like, was he kidnapped by aliens? Did he die? There was the repeating question of, like, whether or not he died, and this is just what came afterward. And there's this repeating thing where furniture will suddenly show up in the cube. Like,
it kind of gives him what he wants, and at times, right? When he thinks of something or when he needs something, it appears.
He does call the shot when the gorillas come in with tutus. And that was a really nice touch, too, because we're all expecting it to happen. But the way that we're seeing it, it's like you're telling them what's going to come in and happen to you, because it seems like something way off the cuff. And then right before the guy leaves, he's like, you're getting better at predicting what this does. But you don't even trust him when he says that, because everyone in there lies. Every single person lies.
They do. And including, how could we forget, of course, the 60s garage band.
Mm-hmm.
You'll never get out. You'll never get out. You'll never get out of the cube. It says you'll never get out. You'll never get out. You'll never get out till you're dead, dead, dead. Till you're dead, dead, dead. Till you're dead, dead, dead. Till you're...
I wanted to, but I want to talk about it some more, but I don't want to forget this. After it aired, it got more mixed reviews than Youth 68 did. But I want to read, there was a letter that they received, that NBC received from Mr. Dion from California. And this is the letter he wrote. He described this as, the most disciplined attention I could give the cube was a belch from the grave of Marcus Aurelius, occasioned, I might add, by the dead weight of its own caving in on itself. That was his response to the cube.
That's an interesting take.
Jim wrote back, Dear Mr. Dion, what the fuck are you talking about? Yours truly, Jim Henson. Pardon Jim's French. Jim was not a man who swore a lot, not at home, sometimes at work, but not, with the guys, because I think Frank Oz, swears up a blue streak. But I just loved that was his response. Like, I have no idea what you're talking about.
I think that's one of the better ones too, because he wasn't defending his work. He was just saying, I don't know what you're trying to express.
I was... I went more literal. I wrote down like, oh, this person comes in, this person comes in. I did notice at the moment where the guy says, well, we're on TV. Let me show you the ending of it.
Mm-hmm.
And he brings out the TV and shows them the end of the special, even though it's not the end of the special.
Mm-hmm.
Reminded me of Spaceballs a little bit. Where they get out the videotape. The prisoner was my favorite part, because he had some really great stuff. The whole stuff about, you and your rectangles, and he was, he wants to escape, but he doesn't know life outside of his cube. There is a lot going on in this thing, and I'm not 100% sure I'm 100% smart enough to figure it all out. I don't know.
It's intriguing though, because you basically got, like, there's I'm gonna mispronounce. I was never a Star Trek fan, but I guess there's a character in The Next Generation, which is just this super advanced being that sometimes comes down to the Enterprise.
Q. His name's Q. Yeah.
The character from the DCU, I think it's Mr.
Mizzleplex.
Yeah, Mr. Mizzleplex. These characters that are very, very powerful, but also just sort of interested in having fun or screwing with people.
Yeah, kind of trickster characters. Yeah.
Yeah, the entire ensemble of people that are moving in and out of the cube are a collective trickster. The bit with the chocolate rabbits and all the other non sequiturs, it's all very, very nice, but I think the thing that did cinch it for me, or the two things that cinched it for me, were the instant apparition of the furniture and the breaking of the frame that showed, like, the sort of maelstrom outside. It's whatever it is that's going on, to tie it back to Timepiece a little bit. These are all things that are completely beyond the main character's control, and he's grasping for control. He's trying to make sense of it. It's like you're receiving orders to do something, and you think that means that you're supposed to do one thing, but there are sub-things or other things. I think they actually had a bit where they were talking about paradox, And the fact that he wasn't able to...
Yeah, there's a whole lot of very self-aware. I mean, he even says, like, you have to come to terms with the fact that you're in a television show. And he's like, no, I'm not. He's like, well, if you're not, then you're crazy. So which one is it? Would you rather be in a television show or would you rather be crazy?
But the weirdest thing, too, is he leaves the cube exactly once. He thinks.
Yes, he finds his door. He finally decides what his door is.
And there's almost this suggestion that if he would just commit to leaving, he would be okay.
Yeah, because there are several times where he asks about leaving and they go, you can leave. He doesn't even attempt to, really.
Because he's expecting the other shoe to fall, sort of like it did with the gorillas and the tutus.
Right.
But at the same time, this is a horrible comparison, but it's kind of like training a dog to go off leash. After a certain point, they're just used to the leash being there.
I thought it was a funny bit when the interior decorator came in.
Oh, yeah.
And she's trying to figure out what color the cube should be.
I think tangerine. Tangerine is just the right color for you.
One bucket of tangerine coming up.
Tangerine is one of my favorite colors. Tangerine is the color of ripe, rich fruit. Of course, you can't look at tangerine all the time. Say, how many hours a day do you spend in here anyhow? Good heavens, he can't spend the rest of his... Well, I mean, you can't look at tangerine all the time.
Maybe we'll go white. And, speaking of which, and then there's like a black militant shows up to complain about how white his cube is.
That was an interesting touch.
Like, he comes in there and you're like, okay, he's talking. And then he goes, you know what the problem is? It's white. And you're like, oh, damn. Okay. All right. This is where we're going. Okay. I mean, again, this is 1969. Mm-hmm. We're in the full swing of Vietnam. We're in the full swing of, we're in the wake of MLK's assassination. These are, while we don't think of Henson as a political guy, I don't think there's any way you're making stuff like this at this time. It isn't reflecting the political world at all. Yeah, I mean, I was writing down just all the people that came and visited him. It's like he gets like 30 different visits or something like that through the whole thing.
You had 2 big party scenes too, and I couldn't keep track of who was a repeat occurrence versus just who would have been new.
Yeah, they brought out. I think some people came back for those. I mean, but then there's a funeral. He tries to kill himself.
That's why I was like, this is probably one of Henson's darker things, because they make fun of him after he fails.
Yeah, he tries to kill himself, and they're all like, "Yay!" Well, that's why it reminds me. It's spoilers for The Game, for the Michael Douglas movie, The Game. But it came out like 30 years ago. I can't do math anymore. It's like 1998. Is that Michael Douglas is, for his birthday, his brother has bought him this experience where basically he gets involved in intrigue and drama and a woman and all that stuff. Like someone would play like a dinner, like a murder mystery game for dinner. Oh, it's almost like role playing, right? But he doesn't know it's a game, or he thinks it's a game, but then it gets so deadly he doesn't really think it's a game.
It's alternate reality gaming.
He's meeting these people and he doesn't know if he can trust them, but then eventually he buys into it. And the climax of the movie is he tries to kill himself. He jumps off of a building. And again, I'm spoiling it, but whatever. He jumps off of a building and he lands on a giant like air mattress, and they deflate it, and everyone's there and they all cheer. Exact same thing. They celebrate. Like, you got to the end. You got to the end.
Well, I don't know who you are or what you are, but I'll tell you something. I've had it. I'm sick of your funny little jokes, your games. I've had it with your gorillas, your intellectual hogwash, your priests, your chocolate rabbits. I am sick of people pretending to be one thing and changing into something else.
And he's like, what the, and it reminded me very much of that, where the goal seems to be to get the person to the point of not wanting to exist anymore. And then going, surprise!
But it doesn't stop there, is the thing. It's relentless in what it does. He doesn't really get to rest. There's no, like, fade to black, him waking up the next morning. It just goes. Like, I think that band comes in as he's trying to get a moment's rest. There's no break. There's a little bit of time for him to reflect, but not really, because he never gets to get his bearings. The rules keep changing.
Yes, that's true. The rules keep changing on him. People keep, it never stops. As soon as one person leaves, the next person comes in. It said the performance by Shaw is very strange to me because I like it, but it's strange because he seems nonplussed, but he doesn't seem like I would be freaking out. I would be screaming, what is happening? Why am I here? He never really says that. He never really questions why he's in the cube.
I think that part of that, like, we don't have a concept of who he was beforehand. Although in that situation, I would probably be trying to wait for someone to slip up and let me know something I'm not supposed to know.
I don't know. I was waiting, and I liked it. I liked the fact that it led to kind of the surreal nature of it and the cerebral nature of it, that he never screamed, why am I here?
He's more Arthur Dent than Charles Heston.
He wants to get out. And I don't know, he has to play this, Shaw has to play this combination of befuddled and I was going to say befuddled and confused, but that's pretty much the same thing. But befuddled and curious as well, trying to figure out what's going on, inquisitive, but also by the end he's very exasperated by it all. It seems exhausting. Mm-hmm. It's a very interesting performance and a very interesting character for someone who really doesn't have a character.
He played it well for sure.
He's intentionally blank though. He's given a name once by a woman that he says that's not his name and that's not his wife.
There is something really curious about, there's a scene early in it where he's delivered a phone and he keeps calling what I assume are different numbers, but he keeps getting the guy that delivered the phone and saying that the phone's not working. And part of me wonders who he's calling then and whether he's actually dialing different numbers or if he keeps dialing the same number and doesn't understand why it's not.
Because at first, if you're thinking about it literally, he gets this phone. He's like, great, I can call out and get help. I can call my wife. I can call my friend. I can call the police. And you're right. And he dials these numbers and we don't see what he dials. And he keeps getting Arnie, the guy who installed the phone, which he's like, Arnie, I keep, the phone's broken. I keep getting you. And he's like, can you hear me? Great. Phone's working. But as it goes on, you're right. I doubt less and less that he's, coming at it fresh. I was thinking like, oh, he's trying to find a way out. He's trying to call the cops or whatever. But upon reflecting and upon seeing the whole thing, I have no idea now what he was doing, who he was calling. Is there anyone for him to call?
Yeah.
The whole thing is just one big question.
Mm-hmm.
And it definitely doesn't answer a whole lot, but it's not trying to.
It almost feels like it's in an infinite loop though.
It is, I think, because I think that the final, even though the Spaceballs ending doesn't come true, the final shot of the show, I believe, is also the first shot of the show. It's kind of, or very close to it. But I mean, it ends with that kind of overhead shot of him just kind of pacing in the cube. I mean, the thing, so people know the thing begins with the dude's face. And he kind of like steps back from the camera, like and he looks around and he's just in the cube. And we have no idea how long he's been in the cube, whether it just happened. I don't know, but it starts off in the cube and it ends in the cube, and that's all we get. There's a little bit of hallway that is probably just in his mind anyway. And then, and there's that red, it almost looks like when he punches the hole in the wall, it almost looks like Doctor Who or something, like there's this mass of energy or something outside and then, Mario the plumber comes in and just kind of, I like the idea that he has different templates for different shaped holes. So the guy throws a hammer through the wall, right? And he just goes and gets the template for this exact random hole in the wall. So it was still funny. It was still very funny at times, but it's also kind of terrifying. It's got a little Kafka to it, I think.
Oh yeah. Like the Dark Crystal scared me as a kid, but this is actually, the cube reminds me of I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream.
Yeah, see, I'm not familiar with that.
Oh, it's a famous short story. It's one of the classic examples of a fate worse than death, because people are being slowly assimilated into this, I guess, computer brain that will keep them alive, but they won't be able to communicate with the outside world. They won't have any sort of control. So you're perpetually aware without being able to really do anything to affect your environment or anything like that.
See, I got that feeling from Johnny Got His Gun by Dalton Trumbo, but that's a whole different thing.
Not familiar with that.
Dalton Trumbo was a blacklisted writer, but he wrote like Breakfast at Tiffany's and Roman Holiday. He was a great Hollywood screenwriter. But he wrote a novel called Johnny Got His Gun, which is a World War I novel about a guy who comes back with no arms and no legs, and he can't speak. And the entire thing is from the point of view of this man who's basically just a torso and a head. And he's alive, but he has no ability to communicate or move or anything. And the entire story takes place in his head. And it's terrifying. It is that lack of control, right? I mean, the decision to kill himself is at least agency.
Right. And he commits, but it doesn't stick. And
no, they even take that away from him. They even take his death away from him, his suicide away from him.
They're able to conjure barriers. Like, he can't interact with certain things as though there's an invisible wall there. And there's even a scene where you're close up on him like he is the regular self, and then it pans out and you see the him that's observing what's going on. But it's done in such a way that you realize, or it makes it seem like he's coming back into himself as the illusory self.
They're talking about how people project themselves differently to everyone. And he keeps yelling, I'm not projecting, I'm not projecting, I'm not projecting. And then he looks across the room and he's in the party projecting himself. He's projected himself into the party.
But there's, in terms of, I guess you'd call them the denizens of the cube, the access they have to this man is complete.
Yeah.
They've got access to his mind, his space, everything he would do. Like, it could go full claymation horror movie if...
Oh, it starts off like a Saw movie.
Yeah.
It starts off like this could be a Saw film. If I didn't know this was made by Jim Henson in 1969, I'd think I was watching Saw.
And that complete lack of, I guess, boundary between yourself and the outside world is kind of terrifying. Because these people, while they might not necessarily be malevolent, are definitely not looking out for your best interests.
They are terrifyingly benign. The people. Like I would almost rather be besought by evil people than dealing with people with that many smiles and how friendly, like they're almost nefarious in how kind of accommodating they are to him. But they're also, every single one of them in their own ways, also taunting him by leaving, by how freely they come and go.
But even then, anything he would ask for, with the exception of being able to leave, even if they're accommodating him, there's always that sort of twist on it, like the literal genie thing where you didn't wish specifically enough.
Yeah, the monkey's paw type of thing. Yeah, I watched Timepiece first, and I thought, well, that'll be the weirdest thing we watched this week.
I did too.
And then I watched The Cube, and I said, never mind. Timepiece makes complete sense, and it is a very straightforward work of narrative fiction. Because The Cube...
It's a Mobius strip.
It is definitely... It is the type of film that I usually don't like. They never stick for me. Isn't there a movie called Cube? I believe there was like a...
There is. It's a horror movie. It's completely unrelated.
I know, but isn't it kind of similar? They're just stuck in a cube, though, right?
I think that's the one where every character was named after a different prison.
Okay. And
they're trying to escape, and it's booby-trapped, and the name of the character, or the prison the character is named after, tells you something about their personality, so... I think there's a guy named Quentin who's named after San Quentin, which is where a lot of more violent criminals go. I don't think that was related to this so much at all. I could be wrong. Maybe it was influenced by it.
It's just not the type of film I normally find films like this to be. And I'm a pretty sophisticated moviegoer, to be pretty pretentious. And I always come out of films like this feeling like they're not as deep as they think they are.
I don't think this one preaches anything, though, and I think that actually comes to its benefit.
I agree.
It touches on things. It discusses things like they go into this whole bit about quantum mechanics, which is wild to me because this is like the 60s, and I'm so used to thinking about that as a later 20th century thing. They bring up all of these points, and then they immediately subvert it in this sort of Matt Stone, Trey Parker thing where they make fun of people, and then they make fun of the people that make fun of the people that they were making fun of in the first place. You never really quite find your feet. And if you were to tell me the premise of The Cube and then tell me how long it was, I would probably not be interested in watching it, because I feel like the premise would be exhausted pretty early on. But it's a juggling act. Like, we're keeping balls in the air, and then we'll throw other stuff in there, and... you're just waiting to see what's going to come down, and eventually maybe you get up to the point where you're juggling grenades and chainsaws. But it's never not juggling.
Over the course of however long this show takes us to do, the word we will probably use the least will be boring.
Yeah.
Even when Henson wasn't firing on all cylinders, his stuff moves. I mean, maybe we can talk about The Dark Crystal is a little bit of a slower burn, but... Even this piece that is, this very kind of opaque idea of this guy in a cube and all these people, it just, because of the existence of all the people that you're talking about coming in and out, it just moves so fast. And it doesn't get bogged down in the tedium of trying to figure it out. In a feature-length modern film, you would have the character trying to figure it out and trying to, like, there's no time for that. Like you said, he doesn't get a moment's rest. He doesn't get a moment to think. And so it's not about getting to the answers. It presents itself as a puzzle, but it's not really. There's no solution to it.
Yeah, it's more of a mental exercise than a puzzle.
Exactly. It's more of a what if, right? It's just, here's a guy in a cube. What if you woke up one day and you were a cockroach, and here's a guy in a cube? And yeah, and it's very similar. It's just you have to go with, like you said, you have to go with the exercise instead of, I think, my modern brain, or my more literal brain. My first viewing, I watched it 3 times. My more literal brain on the first viewing was trying to figure it out.
I think that's what you're supposed to do, though. Like, not necessarily that you're supposed to succeed. Yeah. But I think you're supposed to attempt, because that's you engaging with the material.
There were a few things in there where I felt like they throw them in just to be weird, like the chocolate bunnies.
A, I think you're right, but B, from, I guess, a metatextual context, it does, like, so much of the thing runs on a subversion of expectation, but everything is still set up.
Oh, it's well thought out. It's not that they definitely didn't slap it together. I mean, they had a plan. And it's a plan that they probably knew when they made it. Again, this was for a show called Experiment in Television. And that's what they were doing. They were, whether or not it's real, it's still many times throughout the episode references television.
Yes.
And even says at one point, he's like, you can just turn it off. Like the guy, when he's watching Spaceballs, the videotape, and he's seeing the end of the movie, the guy says, "It's like, well, if you don't like it, you can just turn it off." And it's almost like Henson looking at the TV audience, going like, "Listen, if you're not digging this, it's okay."
Something really interesting there too, because it's presented as though he's getting this happy ending, and then he realizes that it's not the happy ending. And I think did he run toward the screen
at the end?
No, during the Spaceballs thing, because him inside of the TV recognized that he was getting what would nominally be a Hollywood happy ending, and then as it proceeds, he's like, wait, this isn't my happy ending. I'm not happy about this at all.
You're looking at now, sir. Everything that happens now is happening now.
What happened to then?
We passed then.
When?
Just now. We're at now.
Go back to then.
When?
Now.
Now?
Now.
I can't.
Why?
We missed it.
When?
Just now.
When will then be now? Soon.
Yeah, he's with like a woman, I think. Mm-hmm. And he says, no, I don't want this girl. I don't want this. This is not... Yeah, and he starts like... Again, he's in a television, which is kind of like a cube. And he's trapped in it. It's almost like a different version of him. Mm-hmm. Is trapped in his own cube, which is the TV. And, let's not forget that, yes, this was a television show, and a TV is the shape of a cube. So you can even take, you could also just say the cube is the TV. Like he can't get out. He's trapped in the television. He can't get out. So there's a lot of different ways to read it, and obviously that's on purpose. But I did enjoy it a bit, quite a bit. I watched it 3 times. I can't tell you at the end of the 3rd time that I eureka, I solved it, because I really believe that's not there. I'm just saying, I don't think there's something to solve.
I think if there is, it might be that there's nothing to solve, which sounds like a cop-out, but
no.
It's
the answer is there's no answer.
There is an answer in that it is, or there's only one rule, there are no rules.
Yeah, no, a great thing. If you can find, it's a little harder to find, but if you can, I would definitely check it out.
Absolutely worth a watch.
It's definitely worth a watch. It's some cool stuff. In 1968, Muppets Incorporated changed its name to Henson Associates. This conveniently made the company's acronym HA, or HA, which Jim found particularly amusing, especially if you added an exclamation point at the end of it. But it also sent a message. Henson Associates weren't just the Muppets. They could do more. And in 1968 and 1969, Henson was going to prove that. I find these years in Henson's career to be fascinating. This period, let's say 63 to 69, you don't see an artist struggling with 2 sides of his identity, but instead one, attempting to live both at the same time. I don't do a Henson impression, but I think it's important to hear his exact words on this, so I'm going to quote him. In those days, I used to think in terms of having 2 careers going, 2 threads I was working on at the same time. One was accepted by the audience and was successful, and that was the Muppets. The other was something I was very interested in and enjoyed very much, but it didn't have any commercial success, which didn't bother me because I got so much pleasure from working on those non-commercial projects. I thought of myself as an experimental filmmaker back then. These first 15 years of Jim's career are underwritten by that significant dichotomy. Was he an experimental visual artist, content with showing his films in museums and not theaters? Or was he the puppet guy, entertaining and earning millions, making people happy all over the world? He wanted to be both. He didn't want to decide. The rest of 1969 would decide for him.
Next week, sweet air and sunny days.
A Feat of Lunatic Daring is written and produced by Chad J. Shonk and hosted by Chad J. Shonk and Nicholas Jackson. Music by Seth Podowitz. And a proud production of
Antithesis.